Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and sci fi for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape. Doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In this first series, I'm going to be talking to 6 celebrated writers of speculative fiction from South Asia to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, TV shows, radio dramas, podcasts, and movies that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today, we talk to Kuzhali Manickavel, author, editor, and columnist. Her short story collections, Things We Found During the Autopsy, and Insects Are Just Like You and Me, Except Some of Them Have Wings, are a wonderful mix of themes spanning genres. She has also written chapter books like How to Love Mathematical Objects and Eating Sugar, Telling Lies. Kuzhali has written for Granta, Strange Horizons, Agni, Subtropics, Michigan Quarterly Review, and Diagram. We discuss her love of scary movies, the reality of unresolved trauma, using dark humor, and everyday horrors. Hi, Kuzhali. Thank you so much for joining us today on Arc.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
So, to kind of kickstart things, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey as a writer? And have you always wanted to be a writer?
I don't think I've always wanted to be a writer. I think it's just something that happened. But that being said, making up stories and telling stories was something that I used to do a lot. But I don't think at any point if anyone had said, "So do you want to be a writer?" I would have probably said no. I don't think that was something I ever really considered doing. In terms of my journey, I think it's been a very strange journey. Because for one thing, it's not something I set out to do. And the way that I learned how to write was unconventional. And the way that I write is unconventional. So I don't know. I think it just kind of threw itself together and kept rolling. I don't know how else to describe that.
Strange and unconventional journeys are our favorites. So, what was the first story that you remember writing?
The first story I remember writing was actually based off of a dream I had when I was around 5 years old, I think. And I still remember bits of the dream. It was about this large, dark tree, and there was a woman who kept turning into a bat. And then there was an older woman who kept trying to turn into a bat as well. And I remember waking up, it was very fresh in my mind. And I remember trying to write it down, but I was hampered by the fact that I couldn't write very well. And, I didn't know very many words, but I had this feeling that there was this, like I wanted to tell people about this thing. And I remember trying to tell my mother about it, and it just wasn't coming across. She thought that I was scared or something like that. But then I was very aware of that feeling of trying to tell a story and failing. And I feel like that's something that I don't want to say stayed with me, but it's certainly something that's on my mind a lot, because I feel that the story that I actually want to tell never comes across. And I feel like that's how stories work.
That's so fascinating that also so early, it was a story that was quite speculative that came to mind. Your dreams were quite real.
Yeah. Actually, when I think back on it, it seems even stranger because we didn't have a television back then. So I'm not really sure where that came from, but there it was. So, yeah.
And what about writing professionally? I mean, you've written a lot of short stories. How did you start with your publishing journey?
I think it began around 2004, I think. And at that time, the internet was a very different place. We were still on dial up, and, we didn't have any of the social media platforms back then. And there used to be all these online writing forums where you could post your work, provide feedback on other people's work, and kind of just, interact with other writers. So that was my first sort of foray into the writing world, as it were. At that time, the e-zine was very popular. So it was not uncommon for like you to workshop a piece in one of these online forums. Then you would send it out to an e-zine. It would get published. You went back to the forum and said, yay, I got published here. Everyone else said, yay. It was kind of a circle, that kind of an incestuous circle. That was my first experience of the writing world. I feel like that's what the writing world is, basically, kind of circle jerk. And I do remember that early on, I faced a lot of challenges, which I think were annoying and frustrating at that time. Back then, the bio was very important. People would be like, I have an MFA, I'm based here, and all this. And I really didn't want to put a bio up because I felt like it was going to work against me. I didn't have any kind of qualifications, I had no experience. And I honestly just wanted people to just read it and tell me what they thought. And I remember that when I finally sort of caved in and put up the bio, the fact that I was a writer from India writing in English, like that immediately set a mindset for people when they read your work. Either they expect a certain kind of writing, or they're unable to really judge the writing in the same way that they would judge writing from somebody who is Western, quote unquote. I remember one of my pieces, I was actually kind of experimenting with words, kind of crushing them together or altering the spelling or trying to use the English that we use here in India. And the criticism that I would get back was people correcting my grammar or my spelling. And that was very discouraging because essentially that was telling me that, okay, that's all that they see me as, which is why I never liked that whole bio thing. But apart from that, the kind of writing that I was putting out, I mean, it was weird, obviously, but again, it was not something that people wanted or expected to see from an Indian writer. Back then, people were looking for a very specific kind of writing from somebody from India in terms of words, spices, and grandmother, ancestral home. You know what I'm talking about, right? They wanted those kinds of stories. And if you weren't giving them that, they didn't have place for you.
As you said, there's a kind of expectation about the kind of stories that Indian writers are supposed to tell. And I do find it interesting that you've chosen a lot of very everyday Indian things. Like it's set in very recognizable surroundings, very recognizable relationships. And I do think that in the last 10 years, the landscape of writing has changed so much. But do you find that the way people relate to your work has changed as well?
I think so. I'm not completely sure because unfortunately I'm not very in touch with my reader base, as it were. But I do remember that when Insects had first come out, there were people who were kind enough to mail and they were like, this is what my life was like. And I haven't seen it reflected in writing before, which has always kind of confused me because it seems strange to me that we would not write about our ordinary lives, like how the day to day is for us.
Your work has largely been in the speculative fiction genre with some horror elements. And what drew you to that?
What drew me to horror or speculative fiction? Or the speculative fiction part, I'm not really sure how that happened. I remember when I was first writing and I was sending things out, people were asking me, well, what kind of genre is this? And I didn't know. So for a while I was saying it was experimental. Then the experimental writers were saying, oh my God, you can't call this experimental. So I'd be like, okay, it is surreal. And then the surrealists, like, no, you can't call it surreal. It kept going back and forth like that. And then at some point, speculative fiction as a label, somebody kind of said, okay, it's spec fic. I have nothing against the purists saying that, okay, this is what pure sci-fi is, or this is what pure fantasy is. But there is a lot of fiction that is neither this nor that. And it's kind of floating in this waiting room of fiction or whatever. And
You've always been drawn to horror.
I have, yeah. I grew up in the 80s in Canada, which had a very specific kind of horror back then, which I think is kind of shown in Stranger Things. You have all these kids, there's no parents, there's this monster or some kind of an entity, and there's a lot of riding bicycles and, all that kind of thing. But at the same time, in like our real lives, there were things that were pretty horrific that were happening, but I guess it wasn't registering as horror at that time. Like when we were growing up, 1983, back then, there was a girl that went missing. Her name was Tanya Morell. I remember. Oh, she must have been about 6 years old at that time. And there was a huge search for her, and they never found her. And the unnerving thing about that case was the fact that they didn't find anything. There was no body, no clothing. There was no phone call years later. Nobody said anything, and there was no trace. It was like this little girl had literally just kind of vanished into thin air. And when something that like that happens, that means somebody knows something, right? Somebody knows something. And even today, that case remains open. And when you think about that, that's actually really disturbing. That is an everyday horror that has happened, right? And at that time, we grew up alongside of it. It was very much a part of our childhood. And I guess it was only when I became an adult and I'm looking back at it that I'm like, that's a little bit chilling, right? And that's something that you would make one of those Scandinavian noir crime shows about. I feel like there's a lot of those things that happen in our lives, but because it's happening in our life, it doesn't register in the same way as when we watch a horror movie. And I remember that at one time when, I was going through a tough time, I actually found horror movies very comforting because you know what to expect. And okay, that's the worst that it's going to get. But life is not like that, right? Honestly, you don't know. And sometimes things happen in your lives and you realize that anything can happen. And depending on your perspective, that can be a great thing, but it can also be very scary.
Speaking of horror movies, were there any horror movies that were a real influence on your storytelling?
I think there were many horror stories and movies, but one movie that I really enjoy watching and that I continue to rewatch today is the director's cut of The Exorcist. I'm also a fan of I think the BBC put out a radio drama, The Exorcist, and that's also well done, in my opinion. And I really like the television show as well. One thing that I find interesting about The Exorcist is that you have this terrible entity that enters into the everyday life, right? You have this young girl who is normal and life is normal in that house. And then this thing enters and everything kind of changes. I've always found it very interesting to read how people define demonic possession, because one of the things that they will always say is that the devil tries to trick you, that he is a liar. But that got me thinking that's really no different than like this person that's trying to get under your skin and who's trying to push your buttons. It's a lot like the trolls that we have. Somebody coming and just kind of pushing your buttons and trying to shake your resolve. And I always found that interesting because that's actually a very human trait, right? We do it all the time in our lives because essentially the strongest thing we have is words, right? If I use my words in the right way, I can make somebody do something. But to ascribe that to a demon is extremely interesting to me. There's also a really nice television show called Evil, which is I'm going to say it's pretty traditional and straight-laced. Again, you have this idea of this entity that is trying to shake your resolve or whatever. And I feel like that's not just a very human thing, but that's something we often do to ourselves. We sabotage ourselves in those ways. And I feel like a lot of times what we ascribe to demons is just human nature in that way.
I was just going to say that because exorcism itself has like a very long and bloody history. And I mean, so much of it is about dissent and like being different. But I also think it's a classic movie for a reason. There's something beautifully eerie about it. I mean, for one, it's a child, which always kind of really hits you in a different way.
One of the things I actually love about that movie is how they present Reagan at the beginning. You know, she's just even the way she talks when she's talking about riding a pony or a horse or something, the way she's talking to her mother about it, and then how her speech changes over the course of the movie. I think another thing that I really liked about that movie is that there's no happy ending. Nothing particularly good comes out of it. It's not like the demon is killed or anything. It's just that situation changes. And I think that's usually how life is, right? I mean, when you're going through a terrible time, sometimes it's just that things change. It's not that things get fixed and everything is happily ever after.
I also think of it as a very Catholic story because, I mean, for one, there's the presence of the priest. Every time I watch that movie, the scene where she rises from the bed and they are kind of huddled in a corner, it's such powerful, but also the end, the sacrifice of the priest. I think that was shocking to me for some reason the first time I watched it because it felt like it subverted authority in a way. To me, priests authority figures. And then, this helplessness, the challenge of it and the sacrifice of it was very Catholic.
It was, yeah, that's true. Another thing that I found interesting, and I think I find this kind of aspect in certain stories interesting. You see it in Lord of the Rings, that these two priests were in no position to win. The one priest, he had the heart problem. He was old. He was not going to make it. And with Father Damien, right? He had probably the bigger weakness and vulnerability, which was that his faith was, he wasn't sure anymore. Which is why, like, during the exorcism, he's probably the more vulnerable one. And that's something that the demon recognizes. Which, again, I like that whole scenario is just very human to me. We see it every day.
So what aspects of the movie do you think really stuck with you in terms of themes?
So I think there was something about the house at the beginning of the movie. It's got that 70s, kind of vibe going, but it's a nice house. And then you see that as the movie progresses and this evil is sort of growing in the house itself starts to change. It's no longer sort of like this warm, comfy place. And I think that they show that nicely in terms of like the room where she is in is very cold. By the time like she's possessed and the exorcism is going on, people are just sitting and waiting. The house has kind of been, it's no longer a house, it's just a place where people are sitting and waiting for things to happen. Like I always think how it's the same house, right? The same things are still in there, but because this thing is happening, everything has changed. And in the end, even though Reagan is not possessed anymore, they leave the house. I think there's something about the horror that spaces hold, which I find very interesting, especially when you feel you are stuck in a place that you cannot get out of. And a space is haunted. Sometimes a space is haunted, but it's only haunted for you. And it's a normal space for everybody else. that is also a very horrific kind of situation because it's like you can only see the ghost. You are only aware of the demon in the room. I think I find that very interesting, the idea of how space can hold a feeling of horror and fear.
That's a fascinating observation because I think, again, very human and a common experience, even if people maybe don't have the words to express it.
I think we hear the flip of it a lot with the word home. What does somebody consider home? Some people consider it a place, but often it's a person, or it's a collection of things, or it's where I am with my pet and my favorite things. It invokes a feeling, right? And I think that when you think of the idea of the haunted house, we always think of it in terms of like there's a ghost or a poltergeist or something. But sometimes it's just the space itself and what we bring into that space. You know, there's no ghost. We are bringing whatever is the terrible thing. It's in us. That is what is probably the scariest thing.
How do you think The Exorcist influenced the kind of stories that you tell and want to tell in the future?
I'm very interested in the idea of older spaces, like old ancestral homes, but just even an older space, especially like in a school. I don't know if you've seen some of these older hostels or paying guest accommodations. I'm interested in those spaces because you can see that, like, especially in terms of a paying guest or like even certain rented areas, these are places that don't actually belong to anyone. They just see stories just keep going through these spaces. And I feel like because things are constantly moving through these spaces, there are certain things that tend to settle there, right? Which I find very interesting. I'm also interested in the idea of relics. Like in The Exorcist, it's in the pendant, you know? And I feel like we also hold on to our own relics, which make us feel certain ways. We may not have like a full blown army of demons inside us, but sometimes we're holding on to something we don't necessarily want to hold on to, but we don't know how to let it go. And when we hold on to it, it makes us feel uncomfortable or it makes us feel upset. It'll pull us back to a time which doesn't exist. But for us, it is like you are back there again and it is as fresh as when it happened. I find that interesting as well. Because again, a relic may not look like much to someone else, but it is heavy with something for you.
Before we really delve into your work, I'd like to invite you to do a reading from your book, Things We Found During the Autopsy, and your short story, The Twins.
When Anand was 15, he threatened to jump off the roof unless the 13-year-old girl next door said she loved him. He was standing on the ledge, his gangly arms and legs cutting jagged lines against the sky. The girl was at her window, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes, as beads of sweat gently blossomed on her upper lip. Kavita was telling her to just say it, because it was just I love you, and it didn't mean anything. It was when Anand pretended to almost fall off the ledge that I saw the twins. He had chained them to his waist, and they were squalling, grasping desperate fistfuls of air with their tiny hands, the skin on their heads already splitting into velvety petals of dark red. Later that evening, when the 13-year-old girl was being blamed and beaten by her uncle for Anand's behavior, Anand explained that he had just taken the twins with him for good luck. He peered into the box where they both lay shivering, chunks of turmeric sticking to the splits in their skin. One was sleeping, but the other was looking up at Anand, its mouth open in a small, mournful O. Hey, Kikli Kikli, said Anand, tickling its bloated stomach. Hey, Kikli Paya, Fuck off, it said, trying to kick Anand in the chin. Kikalipaya, said Anand, pressing his finger into its face until it started to beat its little arms against his broad hand. He only stopped when someone from the kitchen said the food was ready. They had made him chicken and fried fish as a reward for not killing himself. Kavita and I sat with the box between us, watching the twin cough and shudder. I'm going to kill myself, it wailed. I'm going to kill both of us. It's what I'm going to do. I know, said Kavita, stroking its head. Later that night, our grandfather took the twins and said that if we ever saw Anand go near their box again, we were supposed to tell him so he could break Anand's arms and legs.
Thank you. That was great. The Twins is actually one of my favorites of your work. And I think there's so many interesting elements to it. Can you tell us a bit about what inspired you to write it?
I think it was literally a box, actually. I think I was looking through some stuff that was there in my mother's house. And, there were so many boxes that had things which we didn't even know what they were because they were so old. And yet they were in that box as if it was something important that we had to keep. So that got me thinking about things that we pass on from generation to generation. And again, it's like a relic that we're holding on to, but we don't know why and we don't know how to get rid of it. And in the same way, I think we pass that on within families. And that I have seen in terms of physical things, but also in terms of curses, guilt, ideas that we have about ourselves that aren't necessarily true and they don't necessarily come from us. They're handed down to us, and we don't know why we have them. But again, it's like you're scared to throw it away. What'll happen if I throw it away? I don't know how to get rid of it. I think I was thinking about that. I think that's an interesting.
And the twins themselves are a kind of unexplained manifestation. They're like these heirlooms that nobody can get rid of, but at the same time, there's obviously been a long history where they've been marked by like generations, and they've landed now with the protagonist and Kavita who are kind to them. In contrast to Anand, who's willing to obviously use them as part of as a props in his drama. And was that a deliberate choice to show the juxtaposition of those attitudes?
Yes, because this is something that I saw growing up in Chidambaram, where in certain families, because of what the son was expected to bring in to the family later on in terms of dowry and whatnot, the son is showered with a lot of extra love. I remember that in my classmates, in their homes, it was their brothers that got the sugar or the milk or the egg or the meat. They're treated very specially, and that also extends to behavior. They're allowed to behave how they want, whereas the girls were not at liberty to do that. First of all, you weren't allowed to behave the way that you wanted to. And secondly, you sort of had to pick up and clean and attend to the mess that had been created by someone else.
I think one of the things that really stayed with me in this story was our introduction to Anand in the first place, which is it starts with him threatening to jump off the roof if the girl next door doesn't say that she loves him. And this feels like a very Tamil movie threat.
Yes.
And then you find out that he does it to six other girls in this very matter of fact way. Like, it's almost like an aspect of his personality that you're kind of brushing off as like, oh, Anand, he regularly threatens women.
So again, I think that's twofold. Like on the one hand, I feel like that behavior was allowed a lot because it was a boy and that's how boys are. And I'd like to say that I only saw that in the movies, but I did see that kind of behavior when I was younger. Boys saying, if you don't love me or if you don't do what I want you to do, na setirven. It's a really scary thing, because like I remember going to school with girls. One day it's like normal, nothing is wrong. And then somehow one of the girls would catch the eye of some guy. And then that guy is all of a sudden saying, "Nee vandu enna na love panla na settiruven. If you don't fall in love with me, I'll kill myself." And that girl's life turns upside down because if she goes home and tells somebody, she's the one that gets blamed. She's the one that is not allowed to go to school anymore. You don't even like this person or you haven't even seen this person and suddenly they're threatening you with suicide. It is very scary. But I'm also thinking about the kind of environment that allows that behavior to grow, where it's okay for you to do that. And that's how you get what you want.
I also thought it was very telling that Anand is rewarded for not doing something incredibly stupid with like chicken and fish, and everybody is thrilled that he doesn't jump off the building. And in contrast, this poor girl who's 13 years old and is probably like terrified of him is being beaten by her family for even attracting his attention. And I was outraged, but at the same time, as you said, it's something that does happen.
It does happen. Going back to what we were talking about in terms of horror, that's scary. Like for a young girl, when you're growing up in that kind of an environment, you don't need a horror movie. That is scary. I know that so much of the way that we lived our life on a day to day basis was shaped by how we were protecting ourselves from those kinds of situations. We used to cycle to school, but we never used to ring the bell because that would attract unwanted attention. You're riding a cycle, but you only look down. You never look up. Those kinds of things.
It's so interesting that you mentioned that because I do remember from my own childhood being instructed not to make eye contact. And it's something that I haven't thought about in years. But when I was reading your story and all your work, I found myself thinking of these very small things that are now necessities for women that perhaps we don't even articulate or even sometimes think too deeply about because they're all defense mechanisms that have been developed by watching friends, your own experience, things that your mothers, your aunts, your grandmothers have dropped. I find it fascinating how you worked that into your stories.
I think a lot of us just kind of go into that mode. Our body goes into that mode and we're not even aware. Keeping the elbow out a little firmly, So you're kind of putting a box around your space when you're carrying your keys, keeping it so that they're sticking out of the gaps here. When I get on a bus, just being aware of how you're carrying yourself, who is around you, who is looking at you, where is the nearest exit, where should you be sitting. And now, because I'm older, I'm also seeing younger women who are maybe not as aware or alert. And I'm like, okay, I have to look out for her too, because she's not paying attention.
And coming back to the twins, actually, what really was eerie to me was the kind of repetitive nature of what the twins themselves were saying, which was they had taken Anand's "I'm going to kill myself." And it's almost this mournful, despairing cry of, I'm going to kill myself and I'm going to kill him too. Like, I'm going to kill my twin as well. And to me, it was this very interesting foil to this man who cares for nothing but himself. And the kind of despair of this unaging manifestation, I guess.
It's like a juxtaposition of one person who has no value and who can say and do whatever he wants, and there are no repercussions. And then there's these other entities that have something like a life, but it's almost like only if they make that threat or if they were to do something like that, that's something maybe that people would notice them instead of just handing them back and forth, you know? Because I feel like that also happens where it's like, if this is the only way somebody's going to see me, then this is what I'm going to have to do. But then that same sort of weapon is used in so many ways, right? It's used easily. It's used repetitively until it doesn't have any meaning anymore.
And something I see as a trend in a lot of your stories is you have a kind of laser focused way of pointing out not just misogyny, but the hypocrisy around misogyny. Why is that a theme that kind of you keep coming back to it?
I think feminism and women oriented things, that whole thing has become extremely pornographic in the past few years. And when I say pornographic, I mean that we are encouraging stories where you have a woman that is either being raped or is in abject poverty, and then we get a money shot, which is the rapist being killed by the woman or the poor woman getting lots of money. And that's it. That's the end of the story. We all feel really good and we can go home now. And I feel like that is an extremely dangerous thing that is happening because that's not how anything is solved and that's not how anything is fixed. And I think it's also strange that we're thinking in terms of solving and fixing when we are refusing to even look at the problem really. I think that the whole conversation about sexual abuse in our country is a hard topic. It is not an easy thing to talk about. It's not an easy thing to listen to. But we're not willing to do that. It's easier to just make these money shot movies and move on. I feel like there is so much hypocrisy that bogs down these token movements that we make and sort of like in response to certain things that happen, that it seems strange to even think that we could change anything. But I feel like we've come to a point where we need to start having that conversation. We can't keep pretending that it's a non issue or that it's something easily fixed or that if we do this and this, it'll be okay. That's not it. And it's not something that only women have to tackle or only men. We all have to have this conversation. And I feel like it's dangerous that we're saying that we don't want to, you know?
I think there's a lot of other stuff that you tackle in your work as well, which I think ties into the idea that there are conversations that we not only don't want to have, but sometimes don't even think are worth having. They're so ingrained in society. For example, there's something that I see a lot in your work is like just the general callousness of human nature, even in the smallest of actions. For example, I think there's a short story of yours. Someone is ill, and the protagonist keeps telling them, hey, we'll go when you're worse, or like, just remember how much it costs to go to the doctor. And it's a grotesque thing because it is spec after all. So there is like, it's a horror. This is a weeping horror of wounds. And then you're like also seeing this grim reality of the person caring for the patient being like, hey, it's going to cost 200 rupees to go to the doctor. And unfortunately, it's a grim reality. It does cost money. Some people can't afford it. But this is taken to an extreme, right?
Yeah. But I also view that as one of the everyday horror stories that we have. Like that behavior is not like in a zombie movie. That's in our lives every day. When I was in school, I remember one girl's grandmother had passed away, and it was only when they were taking the body that, her bones were sort of just crumbling. And then they realized, okay, this woman was riddled with bone cancer. And, she would always just sit in a corner. She never got up. She never went anywhere. There's something terrible when we perpetuate certain kinds of living conditions or certain habits simply because we are scared to not do that, or we're scared of what happens if we do something else. So, I mean, I often think like if that family had just checked, or just taken her to a hospital, and instead she was just sitting there in the corner, and then that blows my mind. But it's not like we see that, I think, in all places. Sometimes you go to somebody's house, it's a dinner, and then you can tell that there is something off in the way that the host and the hostess are interacting, or you can recognize it as something that's not okay, but you don't do anything. You just kind of watch that play out, and you go home, you're like, wow, I feel good that I'm not like that. But I feel like you've witnessed an everyday horror in somebody else's house, right?
Absolutely. And I think there's something to be said about acknowledging the everyday horrors because, like you said, a lot of the times we look at it and there's a sense of helplessness and perhaps even the acknowledgement that like interfering would probably make things worse or would not be appreciated. But just admitting that you've seen it is a big thing.
Yeah, I feel like there's this sort of hypocrisy. I'm sure it's in me, and I've seen it in other people, where you talk that woke liberal talk, right? That if you ever saw something, that you would be the first person to do something or whatever. But then when it actually is in front of you, you don't do anything. There are suddenly a million reasons not to do anything.
Which also lends itself to the prevention of that conversation because on some level, I think people also have a kind of preconceived notion as to the kind of person who could be a predator.
Yeah, that's very true.
I think you've also explored this a bit in Eating Sugar, Telling Lies. And I was really struck by how the protagonist talks about their domestic health and talks about the sexual harassment, the daily drudgery, and these like small but very potent cruelties. And for example, I think there's a line about this is the place where she sits when she's finished her work, but we don't allow her to go home. And that really stuck with me because it is an everyday reality. And also, what really impressed me about this story was that this is a kind of power dynamic and toxic relationship that is pretty much there in every household in this country. And it's not a conversation that people want to have, not because I think it's hard. I mean, it's definitely hard, but also because it's considered below the notice of people.
Very much so. One thing that has always struck me is that when we hear alleged stories about the help, they're written by people like us. We're not even allowing them to tell their stories. We're not giving them a voice. And I feel like that really does stem from a fact that we don't feel like they're worth it, right? One thing that I used to see very commonly is help was promised to be able to go home for a month, and then last minute they're not allowed to go because some family member decided that they didn't want them to go. It's this disregard. They don't even register on some level, When I was in Chidambaram, the caste system was still very much in place. So people who had certain caste people come in to wash their dishes, they weren't allowed in the house. They had to come around to the back, wash the dishes outside, and keep the dishes there, and then go back around. They weren't allowed inside the house. So this means that even if it's like wet and raining, even if there's like dirty water out there, these people are standing in that water and they're cleaning it. You're not allowing them in the house. They're definitely not allowed in the kitchen because God forbid they might touch the food, but we're totally okay with making them wash our dishes. It doesn't even register that we're treating them in a way that is mind boggling.
And I think you've explored power dynamics quite a bit in your work. And as you mentioned, class, caste. And also, I think in human and manifestation relationships, for example, the twins and the way the twins were treated in the story. Another place which this felt relevant was in your story, The Good Place, where they captured an angel. That really stayed with me because you think of angels as extremely powerful, kind of holy beings. And the idea of putting one in a bottle and tormenting it a little bit for your own sense of, oh, I have an angel. And the idea that, like, you know what, if something happens to it, it's no big deal. It's just an angel in a bottle. And similarly, there's another one where there's the dragon that has been kind of captured. And to me, that was a real horror because it's very much how some people treat pets.
Yes, that's very true.
But there's this kind of bizarre feeling that you're doing the right thing, that you feel self righteous about what you're doing.
I think we often feel that way about the help because we feel like I give her clothes, I give her food. Without me, she wouldn't have a job. We feel extremely benevolent. We honestly feel like we are amazing because we're treating this person like crap.
There is a real strong element of othering in a lot of your stories, whether it's something that's supernatural or, like you said, the hell. And why are you drawn to those stories?
I think I have a certain amount of familiarity with knowing what that feels like. When I was growing up in Canada, it was the 80s. I was probably the only brown kid in my class. And I grew up understanding institutional racism and microaggressions without knowing what those were. Because when you're very young, you quickly become attuned to the fact that your teacher or somebody's parent or some space doesn't like you because of the color of your skin. And that's something that you don't have any control over. So you've already lost the game simply because of the way you look. So when you're kind of pushed outside, it gives you a certain perspective of how things are operating. You see why you are being excluded. You see what you need to have or to be in order to be on the inside. And you understand why you are on the outside. You also understand the systems that are at work. And then when I came to India, the othering happened for a number of reasons. One was that initially I had this terrible accent and I didn't know Tamil, but I could understand it. So I was often in positions where the people around me, I could hear what they were saying about me, but I couldn't say anything back. Strangely enough, I experienced kind of what the caste discrimination was like because I'm a mixed mongrel, mixed caste girl, right? And, it's a small town. So if you went to a temple, you did have this thing where you were not supposed to touch the Brahmin people. They were passing by. So again, when you're kind of pushed to the side because there is something missing or lacking in you, which you don't have any control over, right? I feel like that makes you look at the systems that are in place and the systems that are putting you on the margin like that. Because just as I have no control over who I am, the people that are at the top and that are just born that way also have no control over that either. They're literally just born into that and they automatically accrue certain privileges and entitlements. When you realize that you are somehow not the same as the people that are setting the standard. And when you immediately get pushed to the side, it's easier to see how things are working. I do feel like people like to talk about themselves as outsiders, but I feel like when you're actually on the outside, it's not nice.
I think what you said about control is something that resonates through your writing as well. Of course, there are the people who are perpetuating this abuse, and there are the people who are, victims of abuse. But at the same time, it's all about control. It's all about either maintaining where you are or seeking something different. And most of the time, as is in real life, there's no control over your circumstances. Life happens and unfolds in ways that you don't expect.
I don't think everyone experiences that, though. I think there are privileged people that their circumstances don't hold them back. And so they automatically assume that the circumstance is something that you can easily overcome. And so they're constantly baffled by people they're saying, well, I couldn't do it because, my circumstances were such. Well, just go beyond your circumstances. If your circumstance has never held you back, you're not going to understand what it's like if it's otherwise.
And I've noticed that the horror elements in your books are integrated very beautifully with the drudgery and the prejudices of common everyday life and concerns. Do you draw from real life? Are there things that you witness or have experienced that you then take to a new extreme? Does inspiration come that way?
I'm sure it does. Like the fact that we use the word drudgery, right? When we use that word, we're talking about cooking or cleaning or whatnot. But if we don't do that, then it's not going to get done, right? And so if you don't cook, then you don't eat. When you think about that kind of a circle, it can seem very monotonous. It's like, okay, I've cooked the food, I've eaten it. Now tomorrow morning, I'm going to be hungry again, so I have to cook again. It's like you are constantly having to take care of yourself. And I feel like because of the cyclic nature of that, it can feel like you're stuck. It can feel like a space that you are stuck in. And I feel like when you don't have to do those things for yourself because they're being taken care of by somebody else, then you don't understand how sometimes that can actually feel suffocating. I think that there are a number of people that when they're young, you're working at a job that's not paying you really enough for you to save. It's enough for you to cover expenses like rent and food, and you don't necessarily have anything left over as such. You're earning money just to pay for this place. It's a cycle. And the thing is that if you are not careful, you could find yourself stuck in that cycle for years. I'm confused about this because I know there are some people that don't look at it as drudgery. It's just work. Why are you being dramatic about it? I respect that and understand that. Maybe I'm still thinking about that, figuring that out.
And are there any other horror themes in particular that you'd like to explore in your future work?
I'm very interested in this idea of people trying to leave a space and being unable to. I think that's very interesting. There's a show that I just watched called From, which explores this really nicely. And I find that interesting because you're trying to leave a space and you cannot leave that space. And sometimes that's the only agency that you have. You're in a shitty position. The only thing that you can do is leave. But what happens when you can't leave? Right? I find that very interesting. I also find it interesting to investigate the stories that are in particular kinds of relics and souvenirs. To give you a better example is like, I've gone through many rentals and paying guests and hotels. hostels in my life. But like when you enter the room, when you're just like looking at it for the first time, there are so many signs and stories there, marks on the wall. Sometimes you can see, okay, this is where everyone leans their head against the wall, or you'll find a handprint where there actually shouldn't be a handprint because you're like, how did a handprint get there? There's all these stories that are there, and I feel like a lot of times we don't see them, or, they're so small that you don't notice, but the minute you notice them, they're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. I think that's interesting. I'd like to think about that.
It's so interesting that we keep coming back to space because when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the safety and security is very high up there. And playing with that in itself is quite a horror.
Yeah. I think the concept of home, when we're this space where it's just me and I can be what I want, is actually a bit of a luxury when you consider there are people that, I'm not saying that they're even living in trauma at the present moment, because they have been through something. That trauma is always with them. So even though they're living in a space that looks relatively safe to us, they are living in that space as if they are still like they're ready to run at any moment. The idea of having security and safety is actually very, very important, because when you don't have that, it causes so many things happen, just in terms of how you view even those words itself.
That's a great observation, because when you think about it, there's a reason so many horror movies and books happen in spaces where people are supposed to feel safe, especially psychological thrillers, things like that. The idea that you could be living your very mundane life with the best of intentions. And this harkens back to what you said about things in the twins as well. You have no control over someone spotting you and deciding to fixate on you, whether that's a real person or a supernatural being, entity.
Yeah, I think it's very unnerving to think that things like your well-being or your security or your safety are not in your control. Something from outside can come at any time and do something to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. I guess in terms of everyday horror, that's a pretty horrific thing, I think.
And as we said, comes back to control.
Yeah, that's true. This has been a depressing conversation.
But enlightening.
Is it?
Oh, yeah.
I feel like having a nap. Okay.
What a great stress response. I did find it very interesting to dig into the inspiration for a lot of the things you write, because you, I think, more than a lot of other writers, deal very much with realism.
Which is an interesting observation, because I don't think people would use that word in relation to a lot of my writing, because I think a lot of times the weirdness or the supernatural of it can kind of make you go off kilter.
I do think it is, simply because I see so many facets of human nature in, and very different, both in insects, for example. I see a lot more hope and a lot more small kindnesses, as opposed to your second set of short stories, where I do feel the theme of everyday horror is kind of heightened in that.
That's true. I was a lot younger when I did insects. So I honestly feel like that when you're young, you can be in a shitty situation with no money and you're still like, you're all chipper and you can do it. It's just when you get older that your resilience in those kinds of situations starts to come down. Guess that's it's my old age reflecting. Yeah.
I do think that there are bright spots, because you do have a wonderful sense of humor about a lot of these things. When I read your work, there are points where I'm like, oh God, that's horrible, but I'm laughing because at the same time, it's being skewered with this wonderful dark sense of humor.
Yeah. I mean, We have been talking about everyday horror a lot, but by the same token, I often see things that they're just hilarious to me.
That is a great way to look at it. And before we wrap up, I'd like to ask you if you have any projects you're currently working on and if there's anything that we can look forward to in this year or the next.
I have endeavored to set up a YouTube channel where I post original audio stories that I've written. It's called Story Cakes. And I only have 3 followers on Twitter. It'd be great if somebody could help me out there. Wow, this promotion it's really, it's tough.
I promise by the end of today, you'll have 5.
I'm going to hold you to that. I really am. Maybe I'll hit 10 at some point. That would be really nice. We have to dream.
We do have to dream big. Thank you so much for joining us, Kuzhali.
Thank you so much.
I'm so glad you agreed to be our guest on Arcx.
Thank you so much for asking me. It's been a lot of fun.
Arcx is a series of the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagining futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or at darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.